Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to IPI. My name is Els de Boeuf, and on behalf of IPI and our co-hosts, the Permanent Mission of Norway and the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, or IDMC, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's important discussion, which seeks to refocus the world's and the New York diplomatic community's attention on the plight of internally displaced persons, or IDPs. IPI prides itself to be a place for open and candid debate on important issues on the UN's agenda here, and internal displacement is, or maybe I should say should be, very high on that agenda today. For the past year and a half, the international community and many of us working here in New York have paid considerable attention to global refugee and migration crisis. Heeding the UN Secretary General's urgent call to address the human suffering caused by these crises and the challenges that come with managing large flows of people on the move, UN member states adopted the New York Declaration on Refugee and Migration in September last year and put in motion a two-track process to negotiate a global refugee and a global migration compact. And some of those discussions are happening at the same time across the street. We have, however, paid much less attention to the 44 million people who have been forced to flee their homes, but have not or not yet crossed an international border. Many of them face similar challenges as those who fled abroad, be it in their places of origin, along the journey of displacement, or upon arrival in their new host communities. But while the suffering and the needs arising of internal displacement are very similar to those arising in refugee and migration situations, there are also specific challenges in preventing internal displacement and in designing an adequate response to the short, medium, and long-term needs, but also the aspirations of internally displaced persons. Perhaps in light of its distinctive features, internal displacement is not part of the discussions around the global compacts on refugees and migration. The New York Declaration does, however, recognize that there are some links, acknowledging the possibility that IDPs might seek protection and assistance in other countries of refugees or migrants if their needs are not adequately addressed. The Declaration also explicitly notes the need for further reflection on effective strategies to ensure adequate protection and assistance for internally displaced persons and to prevent and reduce such displacement. I think this session today is a great opportunity to start that conversation by deepening our understanding of contemporary internal displacement, identifying concrete strategies and actions to prevent it, and by creating and supporting safe, dignified, and durable solutions for internally displaced people. Comprehensive data collection and analysis is key to provide the evidence base that should inform both our thinking and our actions to prevent and address displacement. IPI is therefore very pleased to co-host this event, other than with the Permanent Mission of Norway, with IDMC, because IDMC has, as many of you know, been collecting and analyzing global internal displacement data for the past 20 years. And just yesterday, it published its annual flagship report. We'll hear much more about the 2017 Global Report on Internal Displacement in a moment. But it once more shows record numbers and alarming trends in both new and lasting internal displacement around the world. And for the first time, it also develops a separate section on the increasingly evident connections between internal and cross-border displacement, many of whom we fail to understand really well. The report's key findings and recommendations will serve as the basis for our conversation today, and we have a very good panel to kick off what I hope will be an informative and a candid discussion. But before we turn to them, I would like to invite Ambassador Geir Pedersen, Permanent Representative of Norway to the United Nations, to the podium for opening remarks. As many of you know, Norway has a long-standing tradition of commitment to addressing the plight of victims of conflict and disaster, including those internally displaced. Ambassador, I look forward to your thoughts.
Great to see so many showing up for this very, very important meeting. And let me start by thanking the IDMC for a wonderful report and extremely important work that you are doing. As was already highlighted, the fact is that internally displaced are usually left out of the discourse. It was mentioned the discussions we are having now here across the road on the refugees and migration, and how difficult it has been to bring in the question of internally displaced. But we do believe that the report that you have published, and that we will be so lucky to hear more about just now, will be able to move us forward. Because what we need to do is to focus more on these issues so that it actually comes not only to the headlines of the news, but also so that we can have an active dialogue between the different countries that are mostly concerned. We need you to continue to play a critical role in providing data and analysis, and we hope that we can continue to support you in this usually important, very complex, and underappreciated challenge. As was mentioned, the numbers of internally displaced is above 40 million. The latest 44 million. Okay, we will hear later. The jury is still out, but we will have a decision later today on that, how many it actually is. And as you know, the number of refugees, of course, always also difficult to give a clear figure, but approximately 21 million people. And as I don't know, Jan, if you are going to show the graph where you show how which have been such a dramatic increase in the numbers during the last few years. And that, of course, is linked to the civil war in Syria, but also Yemen, and of course, other conflicts as well. And we know that we need to continue this work to make sure that the dialogue that has been so difficult, and let me pay tribute to Iraq and to the Iraqi mission for being willing to be here and to discuss with us all the challenges that you are facing. These are some of the most complex issues because, of course, we are addressing the issues of sovereignty. And we all know that within the UN, the issue of sovereignty is one of the more complex issues that can be addressed. That's why one of the reasons why we have not been able to move forward on the Syria track, and also so many other issues historically. So what we need to make sure is that we build a trust, that we understand that our concerns are really humanitarian. You know, these are concerns where we want to work with the host country to make sure that together, while respecting the sovereignty, we can develop projects, solutions that together will enable us to prevent this from becoming a real humanitarian disaster and a socio-economic crisis. And this we can only do by a joint effort. And that's why meetings like this is so important. So once more, let me thank you so much, and looking forward to hear a wonderful panel, couldn't be better, with the foremost representative of the World Bank. You are here, Jan Egeland is here. Jan, of course, is, as you all know, one of the most prominent Norwegian diplomats ever. He was the initiator of the Oslo peace process. He was our deputy foreign minister for 7 years. He was the leader of OCHA for many years. So whatever you want to discuss, you can discuss it with him. So this was the PR for Norway for this event. All right? Very good. Thank you so much, and looking forward to a wonderful discussion and presentation.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your kind words and for opening this. As both you and I have alluded to, comprehensive and high-quality data analysis is really key to design any adequate and efficient response to any issue, and most certainly to one as complex and challenging as that on internal displacement. So I'm very pleased to invite Ms. Alexandra Bilak, who's the director of the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, to take about 15 to 20 minutes to share with us the key findings and recommendations of their global report on internal displacement, GRID, us who like acronyms, that's the acronym, GRID 2017. Ms. Bilak has over 15 years experience working on strategy and policy development. She currently directs the IDMC and the publication of this global report every year, and she has a particular interest in understanding the structural drivers and economic impact of protracted and chronic internal displacement. So for those who want the real numbers, or at least the official IDMC numbers, Alexandra, the floor is yours. Thank you. dim the lights.
Good afternoon, everybody, excellencies, partners. A lot of friends are here today, and I'm very sorry for those of you at the back who have to stand, but it really warms my heart to see so many of you here today. Thanks a lot for coming. I'm going to present the key findings of the report, of the 2017 Global Report, and I'm hoping that this presentation will provide a solid foundation for the conversation that's going to follow, which is, in a sense, the more important part of today's event. As has been said already, 2016 was, in a sense, the year in which it was brought home to us how difficult it is indeed to include internal displacement in wider displacement and migration debates. It reminded us of how sensitive this issue is, and in a sense 2016 was a little bit of a disappointing year for IDMC. So let's take a look at what happened in 2016 and why we think this issue really needs to be put on the global agenda. There were 31.1 million new internal displacements between January and December 2016 across the world. 6.9 million internal displacements by conflict and violence, and over 24 million by sudden onset disasters. Now, many of you will be familiar with the distribution of color on this map. As you can see, the orange, the conflict-related internal displacement is, as every year, primarily concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, whereas the blue, disaster-related displacement is primarily concentrated in Asia. Here we go, much better, thank you. DRC was the country that was worst affected by conflict-related internal displacement last year. This photo might resonate with some of you who may have worked in DRC over the last 15 or 20 years. Sadly, it's quite a familiar photo that we've seen coming out of that country, of this human tide fleeing away from armed attacks and civilians having to pack up everything they own, putting them on their backs and walking with their families to what they hope will be a safe haven. Sadly, safe haven is quite hard to find these days in DRC. Now, the reason why DRC came up as the country worst affected in 2016 was because the conflict in North and South Kivu has continued unabated over the last few years, but it's also now shifted to the Kasai provinces, and we're now counting as well as the 900,000 new displacements that we documented in 2016. We also know that since the beginning of this year, a significant number of people have continued to move across the Kasais. We're looking at preliminary estimates of over 1 million people newly displaced since January, 8,000 people every day on the move. Now, the situation in DRC is particularly concerning to us. I have read horrific reports of bullet wounds being predominantly inflicted on children. 90% of those bullet wound victims in the Kasais are children. Health centers have been looted. There's very little humanitarian assistance on the ground, and people are moving, as I said, on a daily basis with hardly any protection and hardly any assistance. This just reminds us that even though some of these countries, and DRC is a particular example of that, even though countries drop off the international agenda, doesn't mean that the conflict and the crisis actually goes away. They re-erupt on a cyclical basis, and it just goes to show that if we don't address the underlying drivers, these peaks in new displacement and in new crises and vulnerabilities will only continue. So I really wanted to highlight the DRC today, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again. But DRC, sadly, was not the only country affected by conflict-related displacement in 2016. Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, who were the countries that we've been monitoring very closely over the last few years. You may recall that in 2015, Yemen was the country worst affected with over 2 million new internal displacements. Even though the figures have decreased slightly for those three countries, it doesn't mean that the situation on the ground is any better necessarily. In Syria, we're looking at many people who were unable to move, trapped in cities under siege. Iraq, the situation there is still very volatile, just as it still is in Afghanistan and other countries in the world. In sub-Saharan Africa, even though DRC was the country that drove the figures and that explains that sub-Saharan Africa was the region worst affected, other countries also suffered from repeated and ongoing insecurity. I'm thinking about Nigeria, where the Boko Haram phenomenon has continued to displace hundreds of thousands of people within Nigeria, but also across the entire Lake Chad basin. When it comes to disasters, we're looking at 24.2 million new internal displacements. Now, that's 3 times more than conflict. The countries that were worst affected, as in previous years, were China, the Philippines, and India. Now, the numbers were driven by a small number of large-scale events that displaced huge numbers of people. In the Philippines, we're looking at 2 major typhoons, Nokten and Haima. In China, the Yangtze River floods, and in India, the Bihar floods that together displaced over 15 million people. Now, the majority of the disaster-related displacement that we saw in 2016 was caused by weather-related hazards, so mostly floods, storms, and typhoons. In the case of the Philippines, we know that the majority of the people who were displaced by these 2 major typhoons were able to return to their homes within a relatively short period of time. We don't have the same kind of information for China and India, and this is one of the major gaps that we have in our knowledge about the phenomenon of disaster-related displacement. We know that in some cases, it's relatively easy for people to return, but in others, displacement can become prolonged and can continue over several years in some cases. Now, if we take population size into account, we see every year that small, low-lying coastal states are disproportionately affected by disaster-related displacement. That was the case in Fiji, Tonga in the Pacific, and also Haiti, Belize, and Cuba. I'd like to say a few words about Haiti. You will all recall Hurricane Matthew that struck in October 2016 and that swept across the US, Cuba, and then made also landfall in Haiti. Now, a significant number of people were evacuated and therefore displaced as a result of Hurricane Matthew in the US and in Cuba. But it was in Haiti that the impacts were felt in the most severe way. About 180,000 people were displaced as a result of Hurricane Matthew, but we're looking at a country that was still recovering from the impacts of the 2010 earthquake, a country with very, very low coping capacity, and where we can see now that those 180,000 people who were displaced by Matthew, a large number of them have not been able to return to their homes that have been destroyed and are still displaced today. 6 months after the hurricane, we were also looking at an area in Haiti that was also suffering from a food security crisis, to only add insult to injury. Just coming back to the global map, we were just discussing this in our team recently, and we were saying there's actually a color that's missing on this map, and we'd like to add it to the map in the future. I don't know what color it will be, it doesn't really matter, but it's a color to illustrate those situations where it has become almost impossible to distinguish between conflict and disaster as the ultimate cause of displacement. Now, there are a few countries in the world where we actually found it very difficult to make that call and to determine what ultimately had been the cause of people's displacement, what was the ultimate factor that pushed people to move away from their home. Now, the current situation in the Horn of Africa is a clear case in point. In Somalia, we're looking at a general context of weak governance, protracted insecurity, chronic poverty, where now severe drought conditions have added to the mix and have taken a heavy toll on communities and also led to the displacement of several hundreds of several thousand people in that country. Now, if we look at the drought-related figures that we did get for Somalia and Ethiopia, we're looking at approximately already 250,000 people displaced. But again, hard to tell whether it was ultimately, the drought pressure on people's livelihoods or ongoing insecurity that led them to flee. This is the number that we were just talking about. So these are the cumulative figures. This is a map that you'll also be familiar with. These are the countries in the world with the largest IDP caseloads. We're now looking at a total of 40.3 million IDPs in the world only as a result of conflict and violence. Unfortunately, we don't have a similar cumulative figure for people who are still living as IDPs as a result of disasters. Now, the data for that does not exist. We're not able to come up with a cumulative figure there. So these 40.3 million are the total number of conflict IDPs across the world. Now, 3/4 of the world's IDPs live in just 10 countries. These are the 10 countries. Those with the highest caseloads are now Colombia, Syria, Sudan, Iraq, DRC, Yemen, Nigeria, South Sudan, Ukraine, and Afghanistan. Now, I think it's important to remind everyone that some of these countries have actually featured on this list every year since 2003. So we are looking at chronic patterns of displacement in those countries. Now, 2/3 of the world's IDPs also live in low and lower middle income countries, countries that score high on global risk indices, meaning that they suffer from high exposure to hazards, weak governance systems, and huge income disparities. So these are the top 10 countries affected by disasters that score between low and high on the Inform Risk Index. And these are the top 10 countries affected by conflict. As you can see, they score even higher on the Inform Risk Index. Now, what does this mean? It means that these countries are both unable to prevent internal displacement from happening in the first place, but then they're also unable to adequately cope with its impacts once it's happened. And because they can't cope adequately with the multiple and complex needs of IDPs, it means that IDPs get caught up in protracted and in cyclical patterns of displacement, and the global figures just keep growing every year. This also means that the new displacement that we report on every year, including these 31 million new displacements in 2016, are likely to only add to already existing caseloads and to become protracted in these countries in the future. It's important to consider this, and I'd like to focus on it a little bit, because this is also what the conversation after my presentation will have to focus on. Why is this important? Why do we have to insist on this point? I think it's important to recognize that the uprooting of people within their own country takes its toll not just on the individual human being and on the communities affected, whether it's through the breakdown of their social networks, whether it's through the interruption of their education cycle, or even the psychological trauma that being uprooted can actually represent. The hosting of IDPs, so as these countries, those 10 countries that I showed, these countries that have to host IDPs over such long periods of time, that mere fact can represent a significant burden, not just for local communities, but also for entire national economies. So it's actually putting a burden, it's actually representing an obstacle to the future development of these countries, and it's just reinforcing and perpetuating displacement risk. It's actually laying down the conditions for future crisis and for future displacement. One of the associated risks of unresolved or unaddressed internal displacement, beyond the fact that it takes a heavy toll on communities and actually puts a huge economic, social, and political impact on these countries. One of the other knock-on effects is that indeed IDPs who remain IDPs and whose needs go unanswered for long periods of time can be compelled to seek protection and assistance elsewhere. They can be compelled to leave their country, to cross a border, to go and seek that protection abroad. Now, although we know that the majority of IDPs in the world don't cross borders, they don't. They remain displaced at home. Many of them don't have the option to leave. And that's why the numbers keep growing every year. So although we know that, we do know there is nevertheless there is an area of overlap between internal displacement and cross-border movement. And looking at these different groups of people, whether they're IDPs, refugees, international migrants, asylum seekers, as entirely distinct and separate or isolated categories, just doesn't do justice to the wider displacement and migration picture. It actually fails to acknowledge that these migratory and displacement flows are somehow interconnected, and that someone who's an IDP today could become an asylum seeker, a refugee, or an international migrant tomorrow. So we know that there's a relationship between internal displacement and cross-border movement. If you look at countries like Afghanistan, South Sudan, the DRC, Sudan, Syria, and Colombia, they're home to some of the largest numbers of IDPs in the world, but they're also significant, they also produce significant refugee flows every year. So clearly there is at least a correlation there. Many of the refugees that we've seen arriving in Europe from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and sub-Saharan Africa over the last few years started off their journey as IDPs. I mean, that's no secret. It's obvious that many of them had to make that journey and that journey started at home. There was a survey conducted in Greece that found that up to 85% of incoming refugees had been displaced several times internally before making the decision to cross the border. So I'm going to now show you a very simple looking diagram, but it's actually not as simple as we may think. We know that there's a specific combination of push and pull factors that determine the point at which a situation of internal displacement tips into a cross-border movement. And we also know that there's a link going the other way too, right? We know that returning refugees or deportees, if they're being sent back to the same conditions that forced them to flee in the first place, can become internally displaced again. Now, our report has documented the case of returning Afghan refugees from Pakistan, where we determined that half of these 600,000 people who have been returned back to Afghanistan have not returned to their homes of origin and have returned to conditions of insecurity, thereby becoming internally displaced again. So that entire cycle of displacement has started all over again. The same goes for returns from from Kenya to Somalia, from the Dadaab refugee camp to Somalia, where we also fear that a number of these returnees are not returning, obviously, to conditions that would be conducive to ending their displacement and putting an end to that cycle. So rather than putting an end to that cycle of displacement and vulnerability, what these returns do is that it only shifts the problem from one place to another. So even though the links are obvious, these links are obvious, there are a certain number of questions that remain. And for us at IDMC, they have become actually key questions that we're very passionate about and that we'd like to understand more in the future, because we're convinced that if we could actually build an evidence base around those interconnections, we would be significantly contributing to protection efforts across the entire migratory route, across the entire displacement trajectory of extremely vulnerable individuals. Now, some of these questions are linked to this very simple diagram here. We would like to know, we know that a certain number of IDPs have crossed borders and become refugees, but we don't know the exact number. We don't know how significant these flows are compared to the entire IDP caseload. Are we talking a very, very small number, or are we talking about something a little bit more significant? Do we even have a sense of scale? That was the question that we were trying to answer with this year's report, and which we were unfortunately unable to answer because the data was simply missing, completely unavailable. We'd like to also understand the exact point at which a displacement crisis actually tips into a cross-border movement. And we'd like to understand whether there are certain types of crises that are more likely to lead to cross-border movements than others. We'd also like to understand if there are certain countries or regions that lead to these types of movements and back and forth movements as well, more than others. And then finally, we'd like to understand the exact set of circumstances under which people make the decision to leave their home. We know, as I said, that there's a certain number of push and pull factors and a very complex combination of different push and pull factors, but we don't really understand which ones of these factors and which ones of these variables are weigh the heaviest ultimately in the decision to leave. Is it physical safety and security that is people's primary concern, or are there some socioeconomic factors that ultimately tip the balance in favor of leaving? And then finally, we'd also like to understand which conditions exactly need to be in place in order to mitigate the risk of returning refugees or even migrants becoming internally displaced again. So what do we need for that? We need better data, and we need that data to be available at every step of the way. We need data on the people who are displaced internally. We need proper data on those who cross borders, because we fear that right now those who cross borders, if they don't appear on, for example, UNHCR's refugee register, they may just fall between the cracks. We don't know where they are. And we need data, of course, at the point of arrival. So for that, we need data sets that are much more aligned, much more interoperable, that can speak to each other, that are actually collecting data and information on these people according to the same definitions, according to the same rules, so that we can actually start making sense of it. There are a huge number of gaps right now, and we fear a huge number of people who are falling off the radar screen. We also need to understand people's situations and trajectories. We need to monitor them over time, but we also need these contextual and systemic analyses of the different factors at play in order to ensure that we can get in the country of arrival, but also in the country of return, so that we can make sure that we can provide adequate protection and assistance along the entire route. Okay, I'll try and be quick. I'm going to have to talk about data just for a couple more minutes. Our data collection efforts and our coverage of IDPs across the world has actually significantly improved over the last few years. This was the map that we had. This was the coverage that existed back in 1995-96. These were the countries for which data on IDPs actually existed. In 1998, we added a few more countries. This was in 2002, 2008, and then finally in 2008 when IDMC started also monitoring disaster-related displacement. So our global coverage has massively improved, but unfortunately there are still many gaps. And I'm not going to go into all the gaps that we face, but perhaps just to highlight the most significant ones that we reported on in our report. One of the big gaps that we have is the lack of longitudinal and time series data. Now, why is that important? We need time series data in order to track people's displacement over time, in order to understand how their vulnerability evolves over time, and in order to determine ultimately whether their situation, whether their displacement has ended, and whether we can take them off the books. Now, one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why our global figures keep growing every year, is because we're not taking people off the books, because we don't have the right information to do so. I mentioned that we don't have a cumulative figure for disaster-related displacement. Now, one of the reasons for that is because the data was unavailable. This just goes to show that out of a potential 90 million people still displaced today, for about 40 million of these, for half of that caseload, the data that we had had only tracked their situation for a period of up to 20 days. After 20 days, no more data. And there were only a few situations there in blue on the left. For about 5 million of these people, did we have a data point after 1 year after the initial event. But even one data point is hardly enough to really understand people's vulnerability over time. So this is a massive gap in our understanding of displacement and how that curve actually behaves over time. And then another big problem for us is the issue of old data, or how we call it decaying data. Even though the data that we have for certain of these long-standing IDP caseloads is updated on a fairly regular basis, the date of actual data collection is very, very old. Some of these caseloads have not been refreshed. New data has not been collected on them for up to 15, 20 years. So even though this paints a relatively positive picture, the reality behind it is far less positive. I'd like to end on the conclusion of our report, which unfortunately is a little bit negative this year. We've ended on a somewhat exhausted plea, probably because we're coming up to the 20th anniversary of IDMC and the 20th anniversary of the guiding principles, and we're getting a little bit tired of presenting the same evidence every year, the same grim figures year in, year out, and not seeing really any significant change on the ground. So we're convinced, as our third point says, that evidence alone is not enough. Of course, it's essential. We need to keep it on the agenda, and this is the way we can keep it on the agenda, but evidence alone is not going to solve this issue. We need far more political will, far more investment, and not just humanitarian investment. We need investment across the board, development investment to work on some of the underlying drivers of displacement, and to also limit the duration, the amount of time that people have to spend in displacement. So I really hope that the conversation today can focus on that, on how to mobilize that political will, given the sensitivities, given the issue of sovereignty, but we need to also recognize, as Francis Deng, the first SRSG on IDPs did already back in 1996, that with national sovereignty also comes responsibility, and that preventing and resolving internal displacement is a national responsibility, but it's also a global imperative. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Alexandra. I think it's worthwhile taking a bit of time to plunge a bit deeper into these numbers, these facts, this data, because by understanding it in a little bit more detail, it might help inform the action that, as you said, is very much required. And you also pointed out that action cannot and should not only be humanitarian, even though that is an important part of it, but has to also span different things. So I'm very happy with the panel that we have today to bring both the humanitarian perspective, the development, longer-term socio-economic, financial perspective, and also, very importantly, the perspective of a member state affected by internal displacement and working hard on addressing that. So before kicking off the discussion with the room, because I also see a lot of people working hard on these issues, who I'm sure can contribute to this debate as well. So I've just asked our panelists to maybe limit their initial interventions to 5 minutes max, so we can really have a bit of time for a discussion. You have your bios, their bios in your programs, but for the sake also of our audience online and others, I'm going to very briefly introduce them. On my left, I'm honored and pleased to welcome Jan Egeland, who currently is the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, but has, as Ambassador Peterson already alluded to, a long-standing career serving both the United Nations and the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Most notably, Mr. Egeland was one of Mr. O'Brien's predecessors at the head of OCHA. Before that, he's also served as the Secretary General's Special Advisor for Colombia and currently still advises the UN Special Envoy for Syria on questions related to humanitarian access and the protection of civilians. And just prior to his current position at NRC, Mr. Egeland was also the Europe Director for Human Rights Watch and the Executive Director of the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. I'm also very pleased to welcome to my right Mr. Mahmoud Mohildin, who is Senior Vice President for the 2030 Development Agenda, UN Relations and Partnerships at the World Bank Group. Before joining the World Bank, Mr. Mohildin held several senior positions in the government of Egypt, including as its Minister of Investment from 2004 to 2010. And he also served on the board of directors of Egypt's central bank. Mr. Mohildun also teaches economics and finance at Cairo University and has held leading positions in a number of research centers and think tanks in Egypt and across the Middle East. And then finally, a very warm welcome to Mr. Firas Hassan Jabbar, who is counselor at the Permanent Mission of Iraq to the United Nations here in New York, where he's in charge of the Third Committee Affairs. And before taking up his current position here in New York, Mr. Jaman has served as head of the NGO section of the Human Rights Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Iraq, and as a consul in the Embassy of Iraq in Abu Dhabi, also working previously with the Policy Planning Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that's going to be it from me. I'm going to really turn it over now to the experts who can share their perspective, as I said, the humanitarian development and the member state perspective on these issues before we throw it back to the room. Maybe I can start with you, Jan. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Els. Wonderful to see so many old friends here today to discuss internal displacement. To me, this annual report is in many ways an X-ray of how international politics, international diplomacy, international peace efforts are faring locally, nationally, regionally, internationally. In a way, how do men with guns and power, in a way, use their power and their guns? And of course, as Alexandra has gone through, it's not going very well. I mean, it's very clear that there is such catastrophic failure on local, national, regional, and international level when this can be allowed to develop and grow as a worldwide phenomena, enforced internal displacement. We have now 5 years in a row with catastrophically high numbers on especially conflict-related displacement. So, 5 minutes. I'll concentrate on Lenin's famous question, what needs to be done, really? And I have 5 points. Number 1 is, of course, end the neglect. It has been wrong, a big mistake, to concentrate so much time, effort, and attention in erecting fences around countries because we felt there was this tremendous influx of refugees and migrants and asylum seekers, and then totally ignore that 2 out of 3 people displaced are displaced within their own country, usually a very poor place with lots of problems. Number 2, we need, of course, it's as simple and as difficult as that, we need to focus on the root causes. What happens is that people are forced out of their homes by violence. There are groups behind this violence. They are supported by people. They are armed by interests. There are political, economic, but also environmental reasons for this total collapse in good governance. And then related to that, a third point. We cannot allow more totally preventable and fully man-made crises to develop. To me, Yemen is such a crisis. Yemen has, I just come from there. There are 3 things that people are in the hundreds of thousands being displaced within Yemen, one of the poorest places on earth. There is no meaningful peace process in a country which is screaming really for a political settlement. It's various groups, sects, political, religious affiliations that can get an agreement. If external actors, instead of bringing fuel to the fire, push them to the negotiating table. Secondly, the sanctions is killing the little economy there, and means that all nurses and doctors and teachers are leaving their positions in hospitals and schools because they haven't been paid for 6, 7, 8 months, and they're trying to survive for themselves and their families. So there is an economic collapse, and it's related to sanctions put in by external actors. And then, of course, finally, they are getting minuscule sums of assistance, Yemen, as in so many of the African displacement crises. Then, two more points. Do not leave the job half done. And for me, Congo is such a case. We thought, when I was the emergency relief coordinator, and with the massive investment we had in Congo at the time, a peacekeeping mission that was growing, growing humanitarian budgets, growing peace diplomacy, and a big investment in free and fair elections, as they were called. And it did go better for a while. And now we're back to it numbered top of our list. Worse than Syria even last year. And the first 5 months of this year is worse in Congo than all of the previous year. Congo is back, and it was a job half done, really. My final point of what needs to be done is disaster risk reduction is still not part of the climate change agenda to a great enough extent. A lot of the disaster displacement that we document could have been prevented with relatively small investments, actually. I fear this quarreling now, maybe with the new US administration and many others, is the climate change, how big is it, who should pay, etc. Will again mean that wholly preventable displacement from disasters will still take place. Ending then, but perhaps trying to be a little more optimistic than our report is, Colombia is the biggest displacement country in a way, and the figure is actually not a good one. 7 million figure of displaced in Colombia is accumulated over nearly a generation. If we had the same for the Congo or for many other places, they would have had higher figures. Point with Colombia is that it's being solved, we hope. There is demobilization, there is disarmament. There is now a law for the victims of both displacement and violence. If it can be done in Colombia, it can be done in these other places as well.
Thank you very much, Jan, for being very to the point, probably under the 5 minutes I granted you, but there will be more time for more later on. So then I'll maybe now, you mentioned yourself, we don't leave a job half done. You also mentioned integrating disaster risk reduction in the climate change agenda, and I think some of the findings of IPI's work last year also showed how it also has to be integrated in the development agenda in order to prevent these crises, both violence and disaster. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Mohilding to bring the World Bank's perspective on internal displacement as a development challenge.
Right. Thank you so much for inviting me and the bank to share some reflections on this very important and welcomed report. Remember, more than a year ago, when we were preparing for the humanitarian summit, the development actors, along with the humanitarian actors, had a meeting with the Secretary General then and the President of the World Bank. And one area, all of them, despite their different backgrounds, different challenges, and priorities, they agreed on one thing that we need to get right, which is basically data and information about what we are talking about. And then we went on in the other three elements about coordination in finance, coordination in the implementation in the field, and innovation of tools related to risk and risk management. But they went back reminding us that for that to happen, finance or implementation or risk management, they need to have better data and better profiles of those who are measured by such data. So the effort is very much welcomed. I congratulate you I know it's done in a very difficult circumstances. I say that because in the normal circumstances, in many cases, we don't really have accurate or dependable data for decision making. I think your report is going to be guiding our teams in the field currently operating in most, if not all, the countries you mentioned under the work that we do in fragility, in conflict, post-conflict, and cases of violence as well. So this is, and here is not just personal view. I'm reflecting the appreciation of my institution to your excellent work. Then the role of development and what can we be doing about that, given that we have better data and better information. We have IDA, which is the International Development Association, the Fund for the Poorest, and with the replenishment, which was successful recently, we have more funds available to support the work in the field, and much of the work is going to be done with the societies, with the private sector, and if available, and in many cases not available, dependable governments as counterparts. We are very much engaged now more than ever before in these areas. Yes, the issues related to root causes of conflict had been related more to our work and the development, but now we appreciate, again, given the data and information, that such displacement is not a short-term affair. And in many cases, it lasts, as indicated in the report, for longer terms that would require two kinds of intervention. First is the intervention required for the host communities, and in many cases, as we have seen, not ready to sustain themselves. And in many cases now we see them are obliged to provide support to their guests, quote unquote. The second, as we have seen it, and we have very good examples that the displaced have many things to offer as well while they are in their host communities. And we have seen that in the investments in education, basic training, and capitalizing on what they can offer could really be a good contribution and minimize the possibilities of further risks going forward. Now we have a variety of programs that could really be helpful. And again, it's not just stopping at the data, but the data and, as mentioned in the report, more knowledge associated with the different profiles of people, their background, what they are capable of doing, what they are not capable of doing. What we are stuck with, basically, in the forced displacement situations is in the particularly treacherous situations for women and girls. And whatever we need really to be doing of more support and funding and the technical support, but the issues related to vulnerability of women and girls need to be taken more seriously. And again, we appreciate the reference to more disaggregated data in these cases. Now we are preparing ourselves, talking about the Middle East, for possible engagement when the time is good for that, to engage with Syria when the time comes, with Yemen, and with other situations. And our team in the MENA region and beyond in Africa as well are getting themselves prepared for further engagement. So we need, again, more updates on the data and the required information for us to do a better job. So we've been here during the last 48 hours with my colleagues from the bank, discussing the finance for development, that leaving no one behind, the issues related to sustainable development goals. And I think the extra effort that we need really to require and requiring us to do more in the internally displaced and the given as well the connection with the neighborhoods across borders with their possible host communities is becoming more critical than ever before. again, and could be for the third time, I'd like to thank the team for this work and for IPI for hosting us. And we have some specific questions at the technical level. My team asked me to convey them to you, but we can take that offline. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mohilin, for that perspective. Mr. Jabbar, I think we're very much looking forward, many of us, to hearing also the perspective of the government of Iraq. One of, as I believe Ambassador Pedersen has also alluded to, one of the countries who have also the political courage to own the displacement crisis and work hard to address it, and in doing so, also seeking, where necessary, the support of the international community. So it'll be interesting to hear from you as well what you see as some of the challenges and some of the key points the international community could also work on to support states who face displacement better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thank you for inviting the mission of Iraq to participate. To participate in this important event. In fact, when we deal with IDPs, we are touching very crucial and humanitarian issue. In Iraq, this issue is more unique since it represents a confrontation between innocent people that just want to live. Their ambition in life just to live peacefully on one hand. And on the other hand, we have terrorist groups. They want to deprive those people to take their rights to live peacefully. This is the equation of IDPs in Iraq. From a practical perspective, let me classify the IDPs in Iraq into 3 stages. The first stage, that when those people feel unsafe in their area, in their environment, and they decide to leave, to flee from this environment to a safe one. So, is it easy for those people to flee or not? This is the first question. The answer, it is not easy. So from this moment, they are IDPs because they are looking for a safe environment. Why it is not easy? Because ISIL uses different tactics to prevent those people from fleeing to a safe area. For instance, they put snipers on the roofs of the building, and anybody tries to flee, they gun him down. They bring families and place these families in houses on the front line. They launch attack against the Iraqi forces. So in this case, the Iraqi military forces can't attach them because they use families as human shields. In addition, they planted explosives in these buildings and these houses. So when they withdraw, they explode these houses and kill all the families. The second stage, when those families succeed to flee and reach a sheltering camps. Here we have different challenges. Challenges regarding the capacity to provide basic services for those families. But the most dangerous challenge we have when ISIL send suicide bombers with civilians to the checkpoints, and those suicide bombers explode themselves there and kill the families in the screening points. So this is the big challenge that we face in this stage. According to the data of IOM reported on 18 May, since the beginning of Mosul operations on 17 October 2016, nearly 376 individuals currently displaced from Mosul city, about 62,000 families. Among this number of IDPs, OCHA's statistics as of 14 May, 326,000 people are currently being sheltered in camps and emergency sites, which have been founded by the Ministry of Displacement and Migration with partners like OCHA, UNHCR, WHO, IOM, and others, while the remainder hosted by communities. As of 9 May, 32,000 people have returned to western Mosul city. After the liberation of this site, they returned. And 109,000 individuals have returned to eastern Mosul, in the area which is liberated now. Number of families have returned to their areas liberated in Anbar, Salahuddin, and Diyala. Different cities are 57,885 families. As of 14 May, there are currently 27 different locations to receive. Now we have different locations prepared to receive about 11,949 people. The third stage, when the IDPs decide to return home. The challenges in this stage are more complicated. For many reasons, many of those IDPs cannot return due to the destruction of their houses, lack of livelihood and basic services. ISIL destroyed the infrastructure of these cities, like safe water, sanitation, electricity, healthcare, education, etc. So it takes time to rehabilitate these cities. For instance, you know what happened in El Gayara. ISIL set fire to the oil wells. 4 months, flaming are sending out black smoke in the air, and that causes environmental damage and health risks to the returnees. And you know what happened in Fallujah. They have planted thousands of explosives in the streets, buildings and houses. And now, from the time of liberation till now, we are working with en masse hard to remove these explosives. Unless the city is clean, IDPs, they can't return. We have new sensitive challenges. You know what happened with Yazidi women? ISIL raped young girls and women. The result of this raping, we have children now. And you know how difficult, to communicate or to integrate those children in the society. Imagine after 5 years, they are at school and they know their parents, their dads were terrorists. They killed the fathers and brothers of other children. How can they grow up? So we have a very, very difficult situation. This is a new case. It needs the support of the international community. In terms of legislation, we need to adopt new legislations to accommodate this new case. In terms of integration and in terms of capacity building for staff who are responsible to take care of those children. The second issue, some countries, they want to return Iraqi refugees and asylum seekers to return them to Iraq. And in this time, we think it's very difficult. Why? Because if any one of them return to Iraq and he finds his family IDPs, it means that he will join the IDPs and we have a new number added to the list. So we have now a dialogue with some countries, European countries, to postpone this procedure till we find a solution to the IDPs. Finally, we thank all countries that support Iraqi people in this crucial time of our history. And special thanks to the people and government of Norway for their highly support to Iraq. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jabbar, for bringing that perspective as well, and with some of these real-life examples. We have a good half hour, a little bit less than a half hour left for some discussion. So I'm going to just take whomever takes a first question. I'll take 2-3 questions at the same time. I see a hand up there and there. Okay, we have a not sure. Okay. Philip.
Yes, well, Philip Sperry from the International Committee of the Red Cross. No questions, but just a couple of remarks. Thanks, Norway. Thanks, IPI. Big thanks to IDMC. Very, very important to give heightened attention to this issue. Very appreciative also to see in that report that for the first time, even if it's the first attempt and very initial, to look at the sort of the link, internal displacement and moving across the border. 3 points that I would highlight on the ICRC side. One is on the legal side, the importance of respect of international humanitarian law. Absolutely crucial in this debate to highlight the point that in terms of displacement, if IHL were respective, rules of conduct of hostility, the prohibition actually of forced displacement, a lot would be gained, but even respecting the broader norms of IHL in protect and assistance areas could also help populations to be assisted and to stay and not further secondary displacement. Second point, more on in the field of, I would say, gaps in terms of accessing population, protection and assistance need, that obviously some of the IDPs cannot even be reached for security reasons. That is one big challenge. Second point, also that there are IDPs that might be physically, one could reach them. However, in urban contexts, for example, very difficult sometimes to access them. And their sort of security, or let's say, the types of violence that one can see, conflict-related, but not just conflict-related, criminality, can mean that IDPs are also in hiding. So you have that challenge. Third point, and my last one, just refers again to this gap on the development and the humanitarian side. All those big 10 major ones, long-term protracted conflicts. So the fact is there that even for organizations like ours, how to preserve essential services, water, hospitals, but now even education, school, all to keep that ongoing. That is a major challenge, and that bridges the topic of how do the humanitarians and the development actors have to work more closely together. The humanitarians might be able to hold some of it, but it's a longer-term challenge. So those were my 3 points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip, for bringing that. Then we had here in the front row from Aurélien. And then a lady in the row just behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Els, and thank you, IPI, Aurélien Buffler from OCHA, and thanks to the panelists, and congratulations to IDMC for yet another grim but great report. And I can't stress how important that these reports are for us in terms of advocacy, and how from the SG to the really bottom of the organization we use this data in our advocacy on internal displacement. Maybe one comment and one question, or 2 comments and 1 question. First, to completely align with some of the comments which were made on the nexus between internal displacement, migration and refugees, and also to the point Mr. Al-Haqqani made about the importance to avoid that today's refugees become tomorrow IDPs. This is really a key issue, and we need to work together on that. Then Jan on I say Jan because Jan was my former boss, so I think. Jan, on what can be done, again, fully agree with you on the whole prevention, resolution of conflict agenda. I think there's also a particular challenge for us in beefing up the response. The emergency response, and you did a lot for that. There's still a lot to do, I think, and we're very glad that several organizations are beefing up the emergency response. But then, in line with what Philippe just said, there's also a lot to do in terms of addressing protracted displacement, this long-standing caseload of people who have been displaced for 20, 30 years. And here, I think we need to think differently, we need to work differently, we need to acknowledge the leadership of the government concerns, we need to come together as financial institutions, humanitarian and development partners in order to support these countries. And OCHA has asked Walter Kalin to lead some research, and this research will come out soon, on how practically we can lead that. Now my question, and it's probably for you, Jan and others, what worries us as OCHA, as an organization who's really trying to push this issue, is the lack of attention, particularly in New York, on this particular issue of IDPs, and particularly in the context of the discussion on refugees and migrants. And my question is, how do we remobilize? How do we make this issue, again, one of the central issues, as it was when you were ERC, Jan, and the year before?
Thank you very much. I'll take, there was a question here as well. Yeah, there.
Thank you.
And then I'll go back to the panel and then take another round before we finish.
My name is Katharina Konzert-Stoffel. I'm working here at the Permanent Mission of Austria to the United Nations. I would like to thank the co-hosts first for hosting this meeting today, and all the panelists for the insightful and multi-layered comments on the issue. I would like to particularly thank IDMC for the report presented, which illustrates yet again that the current level of engagement of the international community has to be scaled up and is not yet sufficient. You have mentioned that in your presentation that 2018 will be the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the guiding principles. And we feel that we should really use this anniversary and create a momentum to put the displacement issue back on the agenda. And as a small step, Austria intends to table a decision at the Human Rights Council next month in order to organize a panel on the human rights of IDPs in commemoration of the 20th year anniversary in 2018 in Geneva. So this is only a small step, but we would be interested to hear more from the panel what else can be done to use that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll maybe let you address those questions, and then we'll go back for one more round. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I'm going to answer the question that you asked, Jan, if you don't mind, on how to get internal displacement higher on the agenda, but also included in some of the discussions that are currently taking place in New York. I mean, those are some of the questions that we've asked ourselves at IDMC. We've looked at the issue from all sorts of different angles, and we were trying to find out what would be the most compelling argument that one could make at this point in time to really get member states, national governments to actually care more about this issue and make it actually in their national interest to address it and to collaborate at the international level in giving it more visibility. Of course, considering some of the economic impacts and the security implications of these large and persistent, protracted IDP caseloads, I think could be one of the ways forward. But one of the things that I highlighted this morning, I went to the stakeholder meeting for the thematic consultation on the root causes of migration for the Global Compact on Migration, was to, and I think that there is an opportunity there that we really need to seize for asking for and being as concrete as possible, but really requesting an enhanced and a coordinated data collection system. And I think that the Global Compact on Migration and Refugees is really the place to actually put that forward, that would enable internal displacement to be incorporated into that total picture, and for the data and the analysis, and therefore also the response, to be aligned and to be much more consistent across the entire displacement displacement and migration trajectory. Now we've actually put that forward as an ask. I know that there are a few national or member states who are interested and willing to push that forward as a recommendation. Several people came up to me afterwards to say, that they would, as long as we can make it as concrete as possible, that is something that could perhaps be included. So I would really go in that direction of using the compacts as an opportunity to incorporate internal displacement, because at the end of the day, unresolved internal displacement is also one of the drivers of international migration, and I think they recognize that. On the issue, one thing that hasn't been addressed, we talk a lot about the better collaboration between humanitarian and development actors, and that's certainly one of our key messages, especially this year more than ever, to say that humanitarian funds are completely overstretched. We've seen, these new crises that are now erupting and that are coming on top of already existing crises. Humanitarian actors are unable to cover all these needs. The needs have far surpassed what's actually available financially. So it's high time actually that the development investments kick in. I'm not just thinking about the World Bank, but more broadly. But one thing that I haven't actually heard is why it is that we can't get that collaboration, why it is that we can't get development actors to work on the prevention side. At what point in time does the development response have to kick in, and why is it not kicking in? Because we've been making that argument as far as I can remember for the last few years. We keep saying we need to bridge the humanitarian to development gap, but concretely, what does that look like? I think that's one of the questions that I think national governments and the international community really needs to answer. Are there certain political obstacles? Is there something that we don't understand? Is there something that humanitarians don't understand? Are we not speaking the right language? I think that there's some of that as well. Humanitarians have their own jargon, development actors have their own, and maybe those perspectives are just not aligned, and we need to speak more, basically.
Alexander, Jan.
Yeah, in addition to this, of course, we need better data and all of that. But what we need is real political attention. And 20 years ago, when NRC set up IDMC, it was on behalf of the humanitarian community, if you like. Even the humanitarians were more interested in internal displacement. We had Francis Deng, we had the guiding principles. It was really on the agenda. And true, on the last refugee summit, everybody talked about the Mediterranean, and nobody talked about internal displacement. So what do we do? Well, of course, we need also to be better, basically, in explaining that this is in keeping with our ideals, that our ideals is that go after needs. And a life in the Central African Republic is as valuable as in Norway or as in the United States. And at the moment, we're not even there, really, mentally, physically, and with money. And then it is in keeping with our interests. If Yemen imploding is dangerous for everybody, really. It's in our interest to avoid that these internal displacement crisis that is associated with so many other things develop as they do. I think we need to be able to get more, Security Council to visit again more these places. People are very good in visiting refugee camps. They're very bad in visiting displacement, informal displacement settlements in countries and so on. Now, on durable solutions, we really look forward to as humanitarian actors, to discussing with the World Bank, the financial institutions, the development partners, how we can complement each other and seeking durable solutions, which is education, employment, but also institution building, including, of course, protection of the civilian populations. The problem at the time is that the humanitarian actors were not good enough to make the 5-year plans as they had in Soviet Union. We're not good in making the longer-term plans of getting to the end result of this. You're very good in making the plans really to get from A to Z. You're not there, however. We are there. We're in the field. We have 12,000 field workers in NRC alone. We need to partner. Yes, please.
Right. Well, I won't blame the humanitarian actors for lack of cooperation. I would start by blaming ourselves, but there have been many positive developments in very negative circumstances that could really highlight a way of going forward. I think the recent work in Yemen, in the countries as affected by famine and food insecurity in Africa, is a very good example of collaboration in the field. We are working closely with ICRC, with different NGOs, with the humanitarian players of the UN system, including WHO, which is part development, part humanitarian, UNICEF as well. For the first time in the history of the World Bank for more than 70 years, we availed our funding for people that we realize today that they have the comparative advantage in the field. And 1.8 billion of funding now is being released through those humanitarian actors in areas related to famine and food insecurity. We had very good example of collaboration with the UNHCR, which actually was our reference in doing the work. We were expecting more from the Humanitarian Development Nexus, and actually, incidentally, today, at the celebration of the first anniversary of the Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain. But I think, yes, it was a good start. But I'm much more optimistic, not with just with the global frameworks of work, but the good collaboration in the field that could really, with good evidence, with having the habit. Now it's not a surprise anymore for the board of the World Bank to bring to their consideration and approval documents to support $200 million plus to go somewhere. And while the bank is not going to be the implementing agency or one of the conventional implementers with us, but could be some of the humanitarian, I'm happy as well that ICRC have been accredited with our work because of that. And this will open the way for others going forward. Just very quickly on one other aspect of work, when we are talking about the development work and the preventive actions, I think in the past we didn't really pay sufficient attention to the work at the local level, at the municipal levels, and in the time of crises, as many of the evidence had shared, and Mr. Sutherland, talking about migration and refugees, he had very important emphasis doing many interventions, Peter Sutherland, about the importance of empowering local authorities, municipalities, to prepare them for a rainy day. And I've been seeing many of them, and there is a great deal of discrepancy of performance in different local authorities and their capacity to be good hosts based on the kind of investment that had been put in them in more proper development during the years with these municipalities. But this is a new area for us as well to work. While it is very much development, but it's development at the subnational level and at the municipal level, which we are engaged in as well.
Okay, we're slightly running out of time. I think so far I keep a hard rule on 2:45, but I see that I think there's two hands, so I'm going to allow those. There's a gentleman here in the front and one there in the back. If you could really keep it to 1 minute, then we can go back to the panel and then for some answers to that and concluding remarks.
Thanks very much. I'm Mark Yarnell from Refugees International. And despite our name, we're very much engaged in IDP issues. Just what will it take for the reestablishment of a special representative of the Secretary General on IDPs? We talked about Walter Kalin and Francis Deng and the significance of these folks. It's not a silver bullet, but I'm just curious to get the take of the panel on this. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was actually one of the questions I had as well, because IPI's ICM project actually recommended that last year to have that reinstituted. So it's a good question to ask to the panelists whether that would make a difference in being able to remobilize and kind of channel the energy. But we'll take the last two.
Hi, Philippe de Korte, UN Habitat. I'm happy to hear from Alexander the kind of increased focus on the pull and the push factors, which requires different data and different kind of analysis. And when we talk about pull, evidently we're talking about urban areas, urban settings. And I must say, the New Urban Agenda is finally saying, look, there are solutions. We have to focus on urban development strategies incorporating the displacement question. But my question to you, Alexander, would be how different will the report look next year to be able to have some of the data and the analysis to focus on that?
Okay, thank you very much. And then there's a lady in the back for the last question.
Thank you very much. My name is Petra Sigrist. I'm working for the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs back in capital in Bern. Alexander Bilak, you have mentioned that 2016 has been a rather disappointing year for IDPs as they have fallen between the crack, for instance, at the September summit on addressing large movements of IDPs and refugees. And at the same time, we have heard that at the national level, there is only limited space for durable solutions, so prevention becomes even more central. And ICRC has mentioned here in the room that ensuring the respect of IHL will become even more important as well. My question now is with regard to the regional level. How do you assess, for example, the opportunities to proliferate the regional frameworks to other continents, such as, for example, Kampala Convention, for example, I don't know, in Latin America or in other places of this world? Or what other options do we have at the regional level to move forward? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Very good question too. So I'll go back to the panel maybe to kind of answer those questions and have any final remarks that you may have. So maybe I'll go the other way around. Mr. Jabbar, do you want to start?
Thank you. Regarding the previous question about how to find safe access to the IDPs, you know, this is a very difficult task that we face. Whenever we find a new access, safe passages to the IDPs, the ISIL uses new tactics to prevent the IDPs. And the last order they received from their leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, they burn any house of IDPs. And now we have hundreds of houses burning because their families left their houses. Something else I forgot to mention about the children who have lost their parents and who have lost all the family. They are mentally affected, and now we are working with the. Today morning we have a discussion between experts from the Ministry of Education and experts from the Embassy of United States in Iraq to find solutions for those children who have lost their family and they are completely mentally affected. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jabbar. Going back in the order that we came from, Mr. Mohildin, any last thoughts or answers to the questions that came up?
Right, just one quick thing related to the two documents being discussed on the compacts on the refugees and migration. And we have an issue, in addition, of course, to the more serious issue related to the internally displaced. It's about the internal migration, which is not taking adequately. And I think if we are starting to take this issue adequately, this could open, as you alluded to, some serious consideration for the more serious one related to the IDPs, though that this is much more politically loaded than the other. We have another issue. It's not, don't just celebrate by seeing a paragraph or two in this matter, but we take it from the operationalization part as a development agency. If we do not really understand the text, we got worried even if it is there. And we see some of the, I know that the texts are not final yet, but we have some issues of concern about the operationalization of the text as they are, even if they are not adequately treating the internal migration or indeed, as mentioned, the IDPs.
Thank you very much. Jan?
Yeah, I'm glad Iraq is here. Very often it's becomes a very intellectual debate about, of researchers and humanitarian workers and so on. You're there, it's your country, you're the lead in Iraq. And of course, you have an enormous responsibility now that Mosul becomes a place where we do not have new displacements in 5 and 10 and 15 years from now on. There will be a lot of tensions there, even when IS is gone, hopefully forever. And here we need to work together, and the development, the political partners, and the humanitarians who will naturally be very nervous of anything that is political, etc. We need to work together so there is protection of civilians in Mosul and elsewhere longer term. We don't want to come back. We have sort of 3 Ps we try to advance in this within my organization. It's protection of civilians. It is pushing the principles that ICRC talked about and is the custodian of. It's extremely important that we adhere to our principles really in being there for the IDPs long term. And the third one is proximity. We need to be there really, not leave the place before the job is half done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So all the remainder of the questions, Alexandra, are for you. That's also why we finish with you. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Just quickly on the 3 questions that were asked. So on the SRSG, from IDMC's perspective, we would support anything that would allow internal displacement to be elevated with political clout up the system. And if an SRSG is the solution, we would certainly support it on principle. But I don't know, to be honest, where that conversation has gone. I mean, it hasn't disappeared, but I think it kind of lost momentum at some point at the end of last year. But certainly something to reconsider. On the urban dimension, thanks, Philippe, for your question. I wish I could say that IDMC was organized enough to already know what the focus of next year's report will be, but we're working on it. And on the urban dimension, we have already started making contacts and progress to start at least at a very minimum, in collaboration with the Global Alliance on Urban Crises, at a very minimum being able to disaggregate the global data in order to give a sense of scale as to where internal displacement is happening and to what extent it's actually taking place in cities and concentrated in urban areas. And I think one of the key questions there, one of the key research questions for us will be to determine whether urban areas can indeed facilitate or not durable solutions and local integration and end of displacement. So I know that we're going to be collaborating on that in the future. And then the final question on the regional frameworks from Petra. Of course, we've supported a lot over the years, not just the adoption, the ratification, but also now the implementation of the Kampala Convention as a groundbreaking framework, at least for sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that perhaps rather than we haven't actually spent a lot of time and energy recently over the last year on considering whether the Kampala Convention or another regional normative framework could be replicated in another region. But on the contrary, we've been looking more at how that normative framework in Africa can actually then be aligned with other frameworks that are currently of relevance for the continent. So just to give you an example, I know that the African Union right now is heavily represented in Cancun, talking about DRR and climate change. And I think that trying to find those linkages and trying to capitalize on those frameworks that do exist, I think is the way forward. When we presented our Africa report last year in Addis, there was a huge amount of interest and it seemed to me, political commitment from African governments, and they weren't referring to the Kampala Convention, they were actually referring more, they were sort of looking at it through the angle of disaster risk reduction and climate change, and I think if that's the way to get them to care about internal displacement, then so be it. So that's certainly something. I think we haven't talked about the other policy frameworks out there, but there are some that we can tap into and capitalize on. So.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think what we tried to do today was start a conversation. It's far from over. We remain very committed here at IPI as well to continue to facilitate that conversation and talk more about internal displacements and what we can do in terms of concrete action. So I'm not going to make any further concluding remarks. Everybody needs to go, but I do want to thank again the Permanent Mission of Norway and IDMC for co-hosting this event, and a warm thanks to all of our speakers today and for you for being here. Thank you.